And I grew up not far from where Steve Biko lived. So, we lived in the same township, streets apart. Actually, at one point, they were in the same street as I was. And I followed him around. And so I got to know a little bit of what he was doing, although I was quite young. But to be young is, by age, it can be misleading in South Africa in the 1970s. But even though I was young, I was old beyond my age, because I was already an activist. At the age of 11, 12, I was already involved in student politics in our little town in King Williamstown. And I'm delighted during the 1970s because the 1970s are different in many ways from a great deal of the history of the political movements that came before. What I want to highlight, though, is that, and I see that, of course, all of this is happening within a broader global context of student uprisings almost all over the world in the late 1960s and the early 1970s. So when you see things like Rhodes Must Fall and Fees Must Fall and all of these movements in South Africa, you can actually think back and say, oh, okay, this is not the first time that students actually had this kind of activism. The 1960s, particularly the late 1960s, were a transitional period from an earlier generation of politics and activists to a new generation of politics. The earlier generation in South Africa of politics was a generation mostly focused on political rights. So you had a generation of people like Nelson Mandela and the ANC, but for the most part the idea was petitioning and protesting black people demanding the right to be treated equally as citizens. What is different about the 1970s, as it was different all over the world, is that you get in the 1970s what I would call a cultural approach, not just a political approach. It was no longer now black South Africans or young people around the world seeking inclusion in the white world. It was now, we want to redefine the entire society. We want to question the values of the entire society. Whether you're talking about the Vietnam War in the United States, or the student movements in Chicago, or in Paris, or in Tokyo, or in Madrid, all over the world, there was this moment, this cultural moment, where young people were seeking to redefine society in a way that hadn't been done in a long, long time. So in South Africa, black consciousness emerges after the banning of the ANC and the banning, of course, of the PAC, and Nelson Mandela and Robert Sobukwe have all been imprisoned on Robben Island. And there's a vacuum in the black community. And people are scared because of the viciousness with which Hendrik Vervoet and his Minister of Justice, B.J. Forster, the viciousness with which they had basically wiped out the liberation movement. And a young man from my township called Steve Bantu Biko basically emerges within that context. And it's very important, it is very important to remember that Steve was only 21 years old. You know, when people think about Biko, it's often they think about this adult who was an old man who was starting the revolution. He was 21 years old when he started the Black Consciousness movement. And this starts with Steve at the University of Natal as a member initially of the National Union of South African Students, NUSAS. Now NUSAS was at the white universities mostly, but it had also some presence in the black universities, but it was mostly a white liberal student organization. A group of white students who were opposed to apartheid. And they had become, after the banning of the ANC and the banning of the PAC, they had become almost the sole voice for the articulation of what needs to be done for black people. For black people. And it was NUSAS, and then there was Helen Suzman in Parliament. However, when Biko goes to a meeting of NUSAS at Rhodes University in July 1967, they arrived there as a delegation of NUSAS, some black students and some white students. The authorities at Rhodes University then say, all right, we're happy to have you here on our campus, except for one little thing. The black students have got to go and live in the township. They cannot stay on campus because they are not allowed to live in town. So the black students must go to, they found a church in Georgia, which is the township in Grahamstown, for the black students to go and stay there while the white students remained on campus. At that point, Biko, who was there all the way from the University of Natal, where he was a medical student, rose and said to his fellow white colleagues, comrades, it's either we all go to the township or there's no meeting. And you can imagine the shock on the faces of the NUSAS students. Because even though they had been against apartheid, and they were against apartheid, they had no idea what the township was. And they couldn't bring themselves to say, okay, you know what, if we are really committed and we are in solidarity with black students, we will go with them and we'll go and sleep in the township. So Biko was using this as a test of the commitment of their white comrades. And I remember talking to somebody called Duncan Innes, who was a close friend of Biko in those days. And Duncan had gone to school at Bishop's. And they said there was no way a boy from Bishop's is going to go and sleep in a township. And Biko was using that moment to make a broader political argument, which is that even though white students and white liberals are articulating the aspirations of black people, they can only go so far and no further. And they can only go so far and no further because they have the option. They can make the choice of going to the township or not. Whereas we as black students, we don't have the choice. So even in terms of then the sacrifices that they are willing to make, if they are in the leadership, they're going to lead to a situation where they settle for compromises that are not in the interest of black students. So as black students, we need to get out of NUSAS and form our own organization. This was July 1967 when Biko raised this issue. And then of course NUSAS refused, and they passed a motion at a conference condemning the university for its decision but not going to the township. 6 months later, at the beginning of 1968, there's another meeting which Biko attends in Staraha, a small town called Staraha. Now this meeting is called by an organization called the University Christian Movement, UCM. At that meeting in Staraha, again the issue of black students being present in town comes up. Because now, if you're black and apartheid, you could not be in town continuously for a period of more than, I think it's 72 hours. I can't remember what the exact number of hours, right? But as a black person, you couldn't be in town continuously for that long. So there was this spectacle where after a certain number of hours during this conference that they were having, they had to then walk to the boundaries of the town, that is the black students, had to walk to the boundaries of the town, cross the boundaries into the township, which is to break the 72-hour thing, and then come back, and then be there again. And Biko at this point says, look, as black students, again, we face conditions and challenges that are not common with our fellow white students. That is when an organization called SASO was formed, the South African Students Organization, with Steve Biko as basically the person who's leading the charge and leading USAS. This is now 68, and Biko is elected the president of USAS of SASO in 1968. There were 4 elements that I always highlight with Black consciousness that really distinguish it from the movements that came before. The first and probably the most important was the idea of psychological liberation. Essentially, what these black students were saying was not very different from what people like Frantz Fanon and Ngugi wa Thiong'o and Malcolm X and a whole range of people, and Paulo Freire in Brazil, a whole range of people have been saying that if you are really going to be liberated, it cannot be just about the vote or getting political rights. It must be much more than that. Liberation is much more than a pure exercise of the right to vote. At stake is the affirmation of our humanity as black people. Because at the heart of apartheid and colonial racism and rule was the notion that black people, and this goes back hundreds of years, that black people were not full human beings. I mean, there was even at one point in time, the American Constitution said black people were only 4/5 human. And Biko was saying they needed to take this psychological approach because you may get to a point where you are free and you get all your democracy, but the attitudes that you've been drummed, that you've been told for so long will remain, and those attitudes will continue to influence how you conduct yourself. So as a black person, you need to have this psychological liberation where you assert your equality. You don't ask for your humanity, you assert it. That's what black consciousness is. Second to that was the idea that white South Africans need also to go through this consciousness raising, as Biko put it. That when you think that you are better than somebody else, there's something fundamentally damaged about you. Now anyone who thinks, for whatever reason, black, white, man, woman, anyone who thinks that they are better than somebody else is usually afraid of something. Is usually afraid that that other person is a threat to them in one way or another. So Biko challenged his white colleagues in USAS and said, look, instead of focusing on black people and working with us, go back to the white community and change this mindset. That is why I say that this movement was different from any movement before, because no other movement was doing that, raising these issues of psychological liberation. The second aspect that I want to highlight is what I call the cultural aspect of black consciousness. What do I mean by that? I don't mean culture in the sense of talking about traditions and customs and those practices. I mean culture in a more generic sense, culture as the quest for meaning. Okay? Or what makes us human, right? What makes us human is that we are all one way or another in a search for meaning. And that's why you find that when people cannot find that meaning in their lives, they go and immerse themselves in drugs or in alcohol, because there's this sense of emptiness, or this sense of how do I find meaning and make sense of myself in the world? How do I find happiness in the world? Now many people find that quest for meaning in religion. And Biko was quite acutely aware of this. And he said to his fellow colleagues in the Black Consciousness movement, we must begin with the church. And they began something called Black Theology. And that project on Black Theology was basically saying to white South Africans and to Black South Africans, there is no way that you can talk about a Jesus who believes that some other people should be oppressed and that other people are better than others. That just cannot be true. There cannot be a Christianity that is based on hatred. So we need to take religion and revise it and give it a liberatory content. And that was one of the most significant developments in the history of the 1970s. That is why people like Desmond Tutu became prominent actors. That is why the church ultimately became probably one of the most influential organizations in the battle against apartheid. Because the Black Consciousness movement went into these areas where people were seeking meaning and organized in those spaces. The other space was theater, drama. So when I was a kid, we went to all these plays that were put up in our townships by Gibson Candy. Plays like How Long, Too Late, Schoolgirl and the Taxi Man. And these plays were again an affirmation of who we are as a people. And Biko used to call this thing conscientization. And then he went from there, he went to literature, the world of literature, and began to challenge us as young school kids to write poems and stories. There was a magazine called Staff Rider. If you made it on Staff Rider, you know, you would write a story, go to the post office, put your story in the mail, there was no email. Put your story and then have it posted to Johannesburg somewhere. And one day, if your story is good enough, it'll appear on Staff Rider and it'll be made, okay? That is the environment that led to probably the greatest creative writing in our history. In the 1970s, we had people like Jabulo Ndebele, and we had a whole host of writers who emerged out of this movement. Now remember, 10 years earlier, it was very quiet in the Black community. Everybody was scared. But what Nigo had been able to do was to say, let us find spaces that are not necessarily political. Let's go to the church, let's go to the literature people, let's go to theater, and let's use these spaces to raise consciousness. And then Nigo also said, it's not enough to just focus on the mind. How do we then get our people to be practical in organizing and reorganizing their lives? And so we created something called the Black Community Programs, the BCP. And the BCP focused on development projects, how to actually help people in the community. So people like Mampila Rampele, ever heard of that name? People like Mampila Rampele and Biko started a clinic, for example, in our township, a health clinic. And as young kids, again, first time we see these black doctors working in the community. The point I'm trying to make is that by the end of the 1970s, we had a whole generation of young black kids whose minds had been shaped to think in particular ways about themselves. And so I could, for example, in my case, I could now apply to Wits University. And I could go to Wits. In those days, black students were not allowed at places like Wits unless you fit in certain technical fields. But I could go to Wits, and I've never seen so many white people in my life. I was like, what? But because I came from that history of being educated in my township, writing for Staff Rider, participating in debates that were organized by Biko, because I had that self-confidence, I was able to stand on my own. Now imagine that impact that I'm telling you about 1,000 or 1,000,000 times more. Because the impact of the movement was now spread all over the country. So that by 1976, students in Soweto were able to say, no. You're not going to tell us who we are and how we're going to live our lives and how we're going to get our education and what our future is going to be. And the reason they were able to do that is because, just like me, I was doing this in my township, they were doing it in Soweto, other people were doing it all over the country. It was because of this consciousness raising. So the psychological, the cultural, and the developmental aspects was something that was completely new in the liberation movement. But there's something else that Biko and his colleagues did. They looked at how the apartheid government had defined black people. They said we were coloreds here, the apartheid government. Coloreds, there were Indians and all of that. And again, this generation said, look, we all are going the same political experience. It's not a matter of being colored or Indian. We're black people. And we're going to take this definition of blackness and develop a political definition of blackness. Okay? Now we know, all of us know, I hope that we know that skin color is the most insignificant, genetically, is the most insignificant part of our genetic makeup. The only reason we develop, other people develop lighter skin than others is simply because, tens of thousands of years ago, some people moved away from the continent, right, of Africa, and moved towards other parts of the world. And as they moved away from Africa, their bodies lost the capacity to produce melanin. We know that, right? The only reason I have this dark skin is simply to protect me against the suns of the rays of the sun. That's the only reason. There's nothing beyond that. And the only reason you have that light skin is because you've inherited genetic makeup that goes back thousands of years, because as other people left the continent, they became lighter and lighter because the body did not need to produce melanin. It's a simple hormonal biological adaptation. But somehow that biological adaptation, somebody in their evil wisdom decided to make that how society is going to be constructed. So race has got no biological basis, all right? And skin color is an insignificant thing. But that doesn't mean that it doesn't have a political basis. Because the reality is that people got treated differently according to this insignificant thing. And so people began to form political identities. And Biko decided to form a political identity called blackness. And he gave a definition of blackness based on the political oppression of people who were called Africans, coloreds, and Indians. But his challenge, which remains a challenge today, with a wonderful essay he wrote called Black Consciousness and the Quest for a True Humanity. But his fundamental challenge was not about skin color. His fundamental challenge was, how do we reach a new consciousness? And that remains the challenge we have today. How do we reach a new consciousness in which we don't give value to somebody else simply because they happen to be of a particular hair color or skin color or shape of the nose? And how do we get people to genuinely believe that they are no better than other people? And that they are no more inferior than other people? And black consciousness, to members of my generation at least, I'm forever grateful for what black consciousness did for me, not just politically, but for enabling me to have a voice. To go to Harvard University or to go to MIT and all of those places I studied, and to be able to state my voice and make my contribution. And that revolution in consciousness is what led in this country, even after Biko had been killed, to the emergence of a new leadership. So that all of the people, or not all, but most of the people who are now in positions of power in South Africa, whether in government or in business or in the academy, came through that movement. I mean, just here at UCT, you had Mampila Rampela, who was a vice chancellor, who came through that movement and became a vice chancellor at UCT. After her, you had Njabulo Ndebele, who became a vice chancellor. And you have people like Bani Pitana, who was a vice chancellor at the University of South Africa. I mean, you can name them. The point is, you have people like Cyril Ramaphosa, a whole lot of people were able to assert themselves and their humanity and their leadership because this movement didn't just say it's all about political rights. No, this movement said it is about asserting our humanity, our equality, not on your terms, which is what the Nusas and the white liberals were saying. No, not on your terms, but on the terms that we define. And those terms are what Steve Biko, of course, was calling the quest for a true humanity. And that battle has not necessarily been won or finished, because it's a struggle that never ends, because human beings are always finding ways of being hateful towards each other. And so black consciousness will always be there, not in the same way that it was under apartheid, because we're not living under apartheid. But here's my last point. If black consciousness has any relevance for black and white people today, it is this. For black people, it's the same message. If you believe in yourself, you will be motivated and inspired to just do like everybody else does in creating a meaningful life. So you can have, a new political dispensation, but you still need that consciousness. For white people, my argument is that black consciousness now is what I call, in one of my essays, we need to take that concept, black consciousness, and we need to turn it around and talk about consciousness of blackness. What I mean by consciousness of blackness is that the white community in South Africa, which has been so closeted and so walled off from the rest of the society, needs to find out what is the black experience. Because the black experience is the history of this country in the long run. The white population in South Africa is about 8%. In 50 years' time, it will be 1%. I'm just like taking it, right? So you need to recognize that you cannot, for a very long time, have a society in which groups of people live in their own closets. Because sooner or later it's going to catch up with you. You can't live a life where you pretend that because you're at Westerford, Kaya nature doesn't exist. And the poverty and the squalor and the inequality around us doesn't exist. And that's what Biko was saying to his fellow students, to his fellow white students. Go into the white community and get the white community to think differently about the condition in our country. Because that is the only way you can engage meaningfully and productively. Because if you don't engage meaningfully and productively, then this whole thing is going to just blow up in your face, and you will have no way, you will have no one to talk to in the first place. And what you will have is what you have in a place like Syria, right? That is not what we want for our country, where we become so estranged from each other that it's easy for people to be violent towards each other. So black consciousness for me is about all of us making that leap of faith. That leap of faith into the unknown. That's what leadership is. Leadership is not guarantees. Otherwise Nelson Mandela wouldn't have stayed in prison for 27 years. Mandela, when he was in prison, had no idea how 1994 would turn out, or even if there would be in 1994. Biko, when he started Black Consciousness, had no idea that this thing would become a big movement. But because these people took their own leaps of faith, ultimately, their actions were able to contribute to the remaking of society. But it begins with a change in consciousness. It begins with each individual, with each home, with each school, so that we can anticipate and prevent as a reproduction of what we've been witness to for so long in this country. The racial estrangement that we've known for so long. So we've got to understand that the differences that we have are artificial differences. Even the issue of language, part of discovering your blackness, part of discovering this blackness is basically learning other languages. And I'm using blackness now referring to white people, because blackness now for me is a historical concept. It's about that other world. How do you find that other world? And how do you interface? How do you become, you find a situation in this country where white people do not understand what the majority of people around them are saying. And it's not just white people, we don't understand what other people are saying because we don't know their languages, we don't understand their languages. So we might as well be in a foreign country. And that's not how you build solidarity. And learning a language is such a wonderful thing. And we know how great it is to learn French and how great it is to learn Spanish. But because we have put value to race and language in South Africa, we say, we cannot learn Zulu or Xhosa. They are not as valuable as Spanish or French. But it is only when you learn the languages, the medical school at UCT, for example, will insist that you learn Xhosa, because you cannot be an effective doctor if you don't know the language of your patient. So we are all operating at half potential because of all these artificial things that we've inherited. And to overcome those things, you need to have a change in consciousness.